everybody, welcome to our channel. Today we're reading Don't Squeal Unless It's a Big Deal.
大家好，欢迎来到双语绘本。今天我们来读一本书，书的名字叫《请不要告状，除非是大事》。开始吧。
Don't squeal unless it's a big deal. A Tale of Tattletales.By Jeannie France Ransom, illustrated by Jackie Urbanifit.
请不要告状，除非是大事。关于情绪管理的故事，作者珍妮·法兰茨，瑞桑姆插画，杰基·沃尔巴万克。
There were 19 students in Mrs. McNeil's class and 19 tattletales.
麦克尼尔太太的班上有19名学生，有19只爱告状的小猪。
It all started when Jessica trotted up to Mrs. McNeil's desk. Peter pulled my pigtail. That must have hurt, Mrs. McNeil said. Did you tell Peter that? Jessica nodded. Mrs. McNeil said, Let's see what Peter has to say. Peter dragged his hooves all the way up to Miss McNeil's desk. Jessica says you pulled her pigtail, Mrs. McNeil said. I did not, Peter said. Yes, you did, Jessica said.
当杰西卡一路小跑来到麦太太桌前，一场好戏就此开始。皮特揪我的辫子，那一定很疼。麦太太说：“你告诉皮特你有多疼了吗？”杰西卡点了点头。麦太太说：“让我们听听皮特怎么说。”皮特慢吞吞地走到麦太太桌前。杰西卡说：“你揪她的辫子。”麦太太说：“我没揪。”皮特说：“你揪了。”杰西卡说
You both have no right to say how you feel, Mrs. McNeil said. You also have the right to feel safe and comfortable at school. Rules like keep your hooves to yourself make it easier to do that, Mrs. McNeil added, but since Jessica's tail is still attached and Peter doesn't look particularly dangerous at the moment, I think it's safe to go back to your desks now. Jessica stopped. Peter snorted. Mrs. McNeil started humming. The farmer on the deal. In the deal. Mrs. McNeil had just lifted her cup of slapper, a quick slurp, when Stephen trotted up. Rachel took my pink marker and she won't give it back. I even asked her 2 times. Mrs. McNeil put down her cup. Stephen, I'm so glad you tried to fix the problem yourself first by talking to Rachel, she said. Maybe her ears aren't working too well today. Let's find out.
麦太太说：“你们都有权讲述自己的感受，也都有权在学校感到安全和开心。不过，开心的前提是遵守管好自己的手这条规定。”麦太太接着说：“既然杰西卡的辫子还好好的，皮特看起来也不是那么危险，那么现在都回到自己的座位吧。”杰西卡跺着脚离开了，皮特气呼呼地离开了。麦太太哼起了山谷里的农夫。麦太太举起杯子，刚想喝一口，史蒂文小跑着过来。Rachel 把我的粉色笔拿走了，我问他要了2次，他都没还。麦太太放下他的杯子。史蒂文，很高兴你能先跟瑞秋沟通，甚至自己解决问题。他说：“也许今天瑞秋的听力不好， 我们去看看究竟怎么回事。
Stephen can't find his pink marker, Mrs. McNeil said. Have you seen it? I gave it back, Rachel cried. I can't find my pink marker. That's because you used it all up, Peter said. You're always drawing pictures of pigs. Rachel sniffed. For your information, those are pictures of moi. What am I supposed to do? Color myself green? You know our class rule, Rachel, asked Mrs. McNeil. If you want to borrow something, ask first. It's how friends treat friends and stay friends.
麦太太问Rachel。Steven 找不到他的粉色笔了，你看到了吗？我已经还给他了，Rachel 大叫道。现在是我的找不到了，皮特说。那是因为你用光了，你一直在用它画小猪啊，Rachel 抱怨道。你们知道的，这些都是我的自画像，我能怎么办？难道把自己涂成绿色？你知道我们班级的规定 ，Rachel， 麦太太说，如果你想借东西，先问问别人，这是对待别人的正确方法，这样才能友谊长存。
Mrs. McNeil had just taken her first sip of slop when Megan announced, Frankie called Sophie a fat sow. Mrs. McNeil had to gulp her slop before she could speak. She cleared her throat and hoped she didn't have a corn kernel in her teeth. I'm glad you know our class rules so well, Mrs. McNeil said. You're right, we don't call each other names. Also, we don't try to fix problems that don't belong to us, Mrs. McNeil said. I know you're trying to help, but if Frankie and Sophie have a problem, it's their job to fix it. If they can't, it's my job as the teacher to help them. Your job, Mrs. McNeil added, is to take care of you. That's the most important job you can have. Megan danced a jig all the way back to her desk. But then...
麦太太端起了杯子，刚喝一口，梅根又来报告，弗兰克叫苏克胖母猪。麦太太不得不匆匆咽下去。她清了清喉咙，希望自己牙齿上没沾上玉米粒儿。我很高兴你非常清楚班级的规定，麦太太说，你是对的，我们不能给别人取绰号，还有我们从不插手自己不该管的事，麦太太说。我知道你很想帮忙，但是如果这是弗莱克和苏克之间的事儿，那么他们就要自己解决。如果他们解决不了，那就是我的事儿。作为老师，要帮助他们解决。而你要做的，麦太太补充说，就是照顾好你自己。对你来说，这是最重要的。梅根蹦蹦跳跳地回到自己的座位，但是
The stampede started! Robbie breathed on me. Jonathan ripped my paper. Emily called my desk a pigsty. Jeremy's grunting and I can't concentrate. Laura looked at me. Sam's picking his snout.
混战开始了，罗比朝我吹气，乔纳森把我的纸撕破了，艾米丽说我的课桌是猪草，杰瑞米总是横出声，我都没办法学习了。拉拉盯着我看，山姆在挖鼻孔。
The students had practically worn a path to Mrs. McNeil's desk and worn out her and worn out her patience. When she stood up, the students sat down. Before we could go to lunch, I think we need to add a rule to our list.
A new rule to our list.
Mrs. McNeil said. A very important rule, she added. Can anyone tell me what squealing is? Students started squealing like their tails were stuck on a gate. Not that kind of squealing, Mrs. McNeil shouted, waving a cowbell. When the class was quiet, Mrs. McNeil continued. Squealing, she said, is my special word for tattling, and I know you know what that is.
大家不停地挤到麦太太的桌前，她的耐心慢慢地耗尽了。她站了起来，学生们立刻都坐回了座位。麦太太说，在吃午饭前，我想我们需要增加一条新班规，一条非常重要新班规。他补充地说，谁能告诉我什么是告状？大家七嘴八舌说起来。麦太太摇摇铃，让大家安静下来，然后继续讲。告状就是专职打小报告，知道你们都明白它是什么意思。
Some students looked at the floor. Some looked at each other. Some looked at the ceiling like they'd suddenly seen something interesting up there. Mrs. McNeil started writing on the board. Here's our new class rule, Mrs. McNeil said. Don't squeal unless...
What does it mean?
Jessica asked. I'm glad you asked, Mrs. McNeil said. To squeal on someone means you go tell a grown-up when someone does or says something. If you don't like, instead of telling that person first, most problems that happen between kids are kids-sized problems. They can work out themselves, Mrs. McNeil said, usually by talking, listening, and helping each other.
有人低头看着地板，有人互相瞅瞅，有人眼盯着天花板，好像突然发现了感兴趣的东西。麦太太开始在黑板上写字。这是我们的新班规，麦太太说。这是什么意思？杰西卡问。我很高兴你这么问，麦太太说。告状就是说，当有人做了你不喜欢的事儿，或者讲了你不喜欢的话，你去告诉大人，而不是先告诉他本人。大多数小朋友之间发生的事儿是可以自己解决的，麦太太说。通常通过交谈、倾听、互相帮助就可以解决。
But sometimes, Mrs. McNeil said, something happens that's bigger than a kid-sized problem, like when someone is hurt or in danger, or when a person is hurting you, or hurting a pet, or hurting someone that doesn't belong to them or that belongs to all of us.
Something that doesn't
belong to them or that belongs to all of us. That's okay. That's when it's okay to squeal because it's a big deal. When it's a big deal, it's an emergency. That's when you need to hoof it and get help from a grown-up. Oscar raised his hoof. I know it's not a big deal, Mrs. McNeil, but I'm hungry enough to eat a haystack. Mrs. McNeil laughed. Me too. I'm sure we'll get to practice what we've learned when we get back.
但是有时，麦太太说，会发生一些比较大的事儿，比如有人受伤， 或者处境危险，有人伤害你，或者伤害小动物，或者破坏一些属于大家的公共设施，这时候就可以来告状，因为这是大事。大事就是紧急的事，这时候你需要找大人帮忙。奥斯卡举手说，我知道这不是什么大事儿，麦太太，但是我太饿了，我都能吃下一个大草堆了。麦太太笑着说，我也是，等我们回来以后再来练习刚刚学的东西。
But that afternoon, Mrs. McNeil had barely closed the
classroom gate
when Katie said, Jenny hogged the rope swing at recess. Mrs. McNeil pointed to the board. Remember what we just learned? Katie nodded. Then you know you need to tell Jenny first about the problem. Tell me what? Jenny yelled across the room. That you were hogging the swing, Katie yelled back. You never asked for a turn, Jenny said. I didn't get a turn, Jeremy said. It's not my fault, Peter said. Not this time. It's Carlene's fault, Sophie said. Who's Carlene? Oscar asked. She's not even in our class, Frankie said.
但是那天下午，麦太太刚要关教室的门，凯蒂又跑来告状。课间休息时，珍妮一直站着秋千。麦太太看着黑板说，还记得我们刚学了什么吗？凯蒂点点头。既然你知道我们的规定，那么你应该直接告诉珍妮。告诉我什么？珍妮在教室的另一边嚷嚷。你一直站着秋千，凯蒂也叫喊起来。你又没说你想玩，珍妮说。一直没轮到我，珍妮说。凯蒂说，不是我的错。皮特说，这次不是我的错，是卡罗琳的错。苏克说，谁是卡罗琳？奥斯卡问。弗兰克说，她根本就不在我们班。
Thump! Mrs. McNeil had disappeared. Are you okay? Megan asked. Mrs. McNeil didn't answer. Her eyes were closed. Her tail was limp. One ear had something red on it. Quick, call the office. Tell them it's an emergency. Somebody get the nurse. Somebody tell Mrs. Hamlin next door.
麦太太不见了。你没事吧？梅根问。麦太太没有回答，她的眼睛闭着，尾巴也无力地耷拉着，有一只耳朵还有点红。快给医务室打电话，告诉他们这里有紧急情况，快去找护士，快去通知隔壁的哈姆林太太。
Later that afternoon, the students visited Mrs. McNeil in the nurse's office. We're sorry we squealed too much today, Jessica said. We didn't mean to make you mad, Peter said. It's all our fault, Katie cried. It wasn't anybody's fault, Mrs. McNeil said. It was an accident. I slipped on some spilled slop. It must have been quite a mess. We thought you had exploded, Jeremy said. It was pretty gross, Oscar added. Maybe you'd better not eat that stuff anymore, Rachel said. You need to take care of yourself.
今天下午晚些的时候，大家去医务室看望麦太太。我们很抱歉今天告了这么多状，杰西卡说。我们不是存心气您的，皮特说。这都是我们的错，凯蒂哭了起来。谁都没错，麦太太这只是个意外。我踩到刚溅出来的汤滑倒了，当时一定很乱吧？我们以为您被气炸了。杰瑞米说，简直乱极了。 奥斯卡补充说。您最好别再吃那些东西了，瑞秋说。您需要好好照顾自己。
It sounds like all of you took care of the problem, Mrs. McNeil said. Everyone says you knew just what to do when I got hurt. Only because you're such a good teacher, Jessica said, and you're such good learners, Mrs. McNeil said. We still need some practice, Katie said. We all do when we learn something new, Mrs. McNeil said. So let's practice. Don't squeal unless it's a big deal.
看来你们都能很好的解决问题了，麦太太说。我受伤的时，你们所说的话，说明你们是知道应该怎么做的。这是因为您是好老师，杰西卡说。你们也是好学生，麦太太说。我们还需要多练习，凯蒂说。学新的东西的时候一向如此。我们开始练习吧，麦太太说。不要告状，除非是大事。
Keywords.
关键词
School.
学校
Squeal.
告状告密
Feel.
感受
Patience.
耐心
Help each other.
互相帮助
The end.
完。
What I learned from this story is to not be such a big tattletale.
OK， 你不是吗？
我不是。
你不是。OK， 拜。
再见。
再见。